What if the price of loyalty wasn't death, but the slow unraveling of everything you ever stood for? London, 1618. The morning fog draped the city in a pale shroud, heavy and wet, as though even the air mourned what was about to happen. Beneath the stone walls of the old palace yard, a man stood quietly, his hands bound, his posture straight despite the chill. His beard had gone gray, his eyes sunken but bright, burning with a strange, calm defiance. This was Sir Walter Raleigh, soldier, poet, explorer, courtier, and traitor, at least in the eyes of the crown. The crowd pressed in tightly, shivering, whispering his name like a ghost story. They had once adored him, the dashing adventurer who brought back tales of golden cities and uncharted lands, who fought for Queen Elizabeth and made England's navy feared across the seas. Now that same man stood at the edge of a wooden scaffold, staring into the void that had swallowed so many before him. A murmur swept through the onlookers as he turned to address the executioner. His voice, low but steady, carried over the crowd. "Strike, man, strike, do not fear." And with that, the blade fell. But the story doesn't end there, because Raleigh's true punishment, the part history rarely speaks of, began long before the axe touched his neck. It began the moment his loyalty outlasted his queen. When Queen Elizabeth had died in 1603, Raleigh's world collapsed overnight. For nearly 2 decades he had been one of her favorites, a man of wit and daring, known for his charm as much as for his ambition. She had rewarded him with lands, titles, and command of voyages across the New World. He had founded colonies, led naval battles, and written poetry that whispered of empire and eternity. But Elizabeth's death brought a new king, James III, and with him, a tide that washed away everything Raleigh had built. James despised him from the start. To the Scottish king, Raleigh was not a hero, but a dangerous relic of Elizabeth's court, proud, independent, and too clever for his own good. Within months of James's coronation, Raleigh was accused of treason. The charges were murky at best, a supposed plot to depose the new king and place his cousin Arabella Stuart on the throne. The evidence was flimsy, twisted, political. But it didn't matter. Raleigh's name carried too much weight, his presence too much threat. He was sentenced to death. Then, in a cruel twist, James decided to spare him, sort of. Raleigh's death sentence was commuted to imprisonment in the Tower of London, where he would spend the next 13 years. Imagine it. A man who once commanded fleets and courtiers reduced to pacing a narrow cell, his empire replaced by 4 damp walls. The clatter of keys became his new music, the drip of water his constant rhythm. He was allowed books and writing materials, small mercies that became his salvation. Within those cold walls, he wrote some of the most remarkable works of his life, essays, poetry, and an ambitious history of the world. His son was born during that time, and for a while, hope flickered. But the world outside forgot him. His enemies whispered to the king, spinning tales of Raleigh's arrogance, his untrustworthy nature. His name became a ghost of a past England, a symbol of a queen long gone and an empire not yet realized. Then, in 1616, a strange opportunity emerged, a chance to reclaim his freedom, but at a terrible cost. James I, ever the political gambler, saw value in using Raleigh one last time. Years earlier, Raleigh had claimed to know of a city of gold deep within the jungles of South America, El Dorado. The Spanish had their suspicions, the English their doubts, but the myth lingered. And James, eager to profit without war, struck a bargain. Raleigh would lead an expedition to find the gold of Guyana. If he succeeded, his fortune and honor would be restored. But there was one condition. He was forbidden to engage in any conflict with the Spanish, England's uneasy allies. Raleigh agreed. What choice did he have? He was nearly 60 years old, his health failing, but the dream of redemption burned too brightly to ignore. When his ships set sail down the Thames, Londoners gathered to watch. Some cheered, others scoffed. The man once destined to build an empire now sailed as a broken echo of his former glory. The voyage was cursed from the start. Tropical storms battered the fleet. Disease thinned the crew. Supplies rotted, tempers flared, and Raleigh's authority waned. Then came the worst blow. His son, Wat Raleigh, was killed during a skirmish with Spanish forces near the Orinoco River, the very thing Raleigh had been ordered to avoid. When the news reached him, the old man reportedly fell silent for hours. The legend of El Dorado had claimed its final believer. He knew then that his expedition and his life were doomed. By the time Raleigh limped back to England in 1618, he was not returning as a hero, but as a condemned man walking into his own shadow. The Spanish ambassador demanded justice, furious that Raleigh had attacked their settlements. King James, desperate to maintain peace, found his scapegoat waiting at his doorstep. The king didn't need a new trial. Raleigh's old death sentence from 1603 was still valid. All James had to do was sign the order. And he did, without hesitation. Raleigh was taken back to the Tower, but this time the walls were colder, the air thicker. He knew there would be no reprieve. In those final days he wrote letters to his wife, his tone not bitter, but strangely peaceful. "Let them that are in love with security and riches have them," he wrote. "I am a soldier and look for danger." On the morning of October 29, 1618, as he was led to the scaffold, he refused the priest's offer of confession. "I have a long journey to take," he said calmly. "Therefore I will first discharge my conscience." He gave his final speech, not as a man defeated, but as one who had already accepted the cruel poetry of his fate. Even the crowd seemed torn between awe and sorrow. One onlooker later wrote, "He was the most fearless man that ever was known." When the axe fell, it took 2 blows. The executioner, trembling, had missed the first strike. And for a heartbeat, the man who had once seen half the world lived again, his blood rushing through the boards, the echo of his name carried into the gray sky. Yet perhaps the cruelest punishment was not death itself, but the years that preceded it, the endless decay of a man who had once been larger than life. To be forgotten, then used, then discarded like a pawn in a king's game. That was Sir Walter Raleigh's true execution. They say his head was embalmed and kept by his wife for 29 years until her death. When visitors came to her home, she would show them the casket with quiet reverence. "It was once the head of my husband," she'd whisper. "He loved his king too much." And somewhere, beneath the soft hum of English rain, the world that Raleigh had dreamed of, the empire he'd sought to build, the lands he'd tried to claim, went on without him. But legends have a way of surviving where men do not. His name still flickers in old books and sea journals, in the scent of tobacco, in the whisper of explorers who followed his path into the unknown. Because the man who lost everything in the name of loyalty left behind something far more dangerous than gold. A story. And stories, unlike kings, never truly die. Yet what few know is that before that final dawn, before the crowd gathered to witness the end of him, Raleigh did something no historian could ever quite explain, an act that still confuses scholars and unsettles those who study his life. Something he left behind, something that might suggest he never intended to die at all. The night before his execution, the Tower of London was unusually quiet. The rain had stopped and the fog hung heavy along the Thames, swallowing the distant bells of Westminster. Inside his cell, Sir Walter Raleigh sat by the dim glow of a candle. Its flame trembled with every breath of wind sneaking through the iron bars. He had written his final letters, to his wife, to his son, long buried under South American soil, and, perhaps most curiously, to someone unknown. The paper lay folded, sealed, and unaddressed. Only a single mark adorned the outer side, a symbol that none of the guards recognized, a small sun drawn over a river. It was the same emblem Raleigh had once carved onto the handle of his sword, the same sign his crewmen had painted on their ships before they sailed for Guiana. It was not the emblem of England or any royal house. It was something else. Something older. The guards would later say he seemed almost at peace that night. Not resigned, not broken, but thoughtful, like a man preparing for a journey rather than an end. One guard, a young recruit barely 20, claimed that just before dawn, Raleigh spoke quietly into the shadows. "The world is round," he said, almost smiling. and truth travels farther than any ship I've ever sailed. When the cell was emptied the next morning, the strange letter was gone. The candle had burned to the base, and the table bore a single faint scorch mark, a curved line, like the trace of a compass drawing the edge of the world. For years afterward, that night was dismissed as imagination, the nervous inventions of frightened men. But centuries later, when historians examined the tower archives, a curious record appeared in the guard logbook. Item confiscated, sealed parchment with unknown mark. Subject claimed it to be his last chart. No one ever found that chart. Yet some believe Raleigh's final act wasn't surrender. It was preparation. Because for all his loyalty and downfall, Raleigh had one secret the Crown never truly uncovered: the truth about what he found, and didn't find, in South America. In the early months of 1618, before the voyage turned disastrous, his men recorded sightings that still baffle historians. Deep in the Orinoco Basin, where mist clings to the trees and the air hums with the sound of unseen creatures, they stumbled upon ancient ruins, fragments of carved stone buried beneath jungle vines. Some swore the carvings resembled European figures, others said they shimmered as if made of metal not native to the region. Raleigh's journal, what remains of it, mentions none of this. Pages are missing, torn, scorched, or written over, but a separate diary, kept by one of his officers, Captain Keymis, tells another story. It speaks of a hidden settlement beyond the river's turn, whose people vanished like smoke, and a single cryptic note in the margin. He said we must not speak of it. Not yet. Was this Raleigh's El Dorado, or something far stranger? When news reached London of his failure and his son's death, Raleigh reportedly ordered all remaining maps and documents destroyed. Only fragments survived: symbols, coordinates, strange geometric designs. His enemies at court assumed madness. His supporters whispered that he had found something too dangerous to bring back. And so when Raleigh sat in that tower cell years later, sketching the faint arc of a circle across his table, perhaps he was not thinking of his death, but of his discovery, the one that could not die with him. After his execution, his body was buried at St. Margaret's Church near Westminster Abbey. His head, embalmed and sealed, was given to his wife as she had requested. But here, too, the story twists into legend. In the years that followed, Lady Raleigh lived quietly, moving between homes, avoiding public life. Visitors claimed she kept her husband's head in a small velvet bag, wrapped in silk. To some, she showed it. To others, she denied it existed. But one account stands out, from a scholar named Thomas Harriot, a mathematician and close friend of Raleigh's. In a letter written in 1622, he described visiting her estate and being shown a small chest within which lay a token of one who had seen beyond the veil. He did not specify what he meant, but his later writings mention a map of the invisible world, signed with the same sun over river symbol. Then abruptly Harriot died. His papers were confiscated by order of the Crown. The mystery might have ended there, a tragic tale of power, betrayal, and fading loyalty. But nearly 2 centuries later, during the reign of George III, builders renovating a section of the tower uncovered a sealed compartment behind the stones of Raleigh's old cell. Inside was a rusted metal box. Within it, a few brittle pages remained intact: sketches of coastlines, astronomical calculations, and a message scrawled in faded ink. The treasure is not of gold, but of mind. The empire, not of earth, but of thought. Historians dismissed it as a forgery, perhaps a hoax by a later romantic. Yet the handwriting matched Raleigh's precisely. It painted a picture of a man who, even at the end, refused to believe his life's work had failed. His voyages, his imprisonment, his downfall, all of it seemed to feed into a single idea. That discovery was not about conquest or gold, but the pursuit of knowledge, of the infinite. And maybe that's why King James feared him so deeply, because men like Raleigh could not be controlled by thrones. He had seen too much of the world to bow quietly before one. Even in death, his story lingered like smoke. Travelers along the Orinoco still tell tales of an Englishman's ghost, an old figure in half armor, standing by the water's edge at dawn, watching the sun rise through the mist. Sometimes, they say, he's holding something in his hands, a rolled map, edges burned, its markings faint as a dream. But if Raleigh's punishment was death, his curse was remembrance. His name haunted every explorer who followed him. They chased his dream of El Dorado for centuries, each time vanishing deeper into jungles that seemed to consume the living. None found gold. All found madness. And still, somewhere between history and myth, the question lingered. What if Raleigh had been right? What if El Dorado was never a city, but an idea? A truth too vast for the small minds of kings and courtiers. The very notion terrified his contemporaries. Because if that were true, then Raleigh hadn't failed. He had simply outgrown the world that condemned him. There's one more piece to the story. In 1660, decades after Raleigh's death, an auction in London catalogued a curious object. An old leather-bound volume containing charts of the Indies, some burned, marked with symbols, and a letter attributed to Sir W.R. The buyer was unknown. The book vanished from record, but in 1894, an explorer named Charles Waterton claimed to have seen a map in a private collection in Spain, bearing Raleigh's signature and that same sun-over-river emblem. The chart did not depict the coastlines of any known country. Instead, it showed a vast circular landmass with rivers forming a perfect spiral, converging at a single point marked only with the word veritas, truth. Was it Raleigh's vision of the world, his metaphor for discovery, or something else entirely, a code that only he could decipher? Every historian who's examined his life agrees on one thing. Raleigh was a man out of time, too curious for a world built on obedience, too bold for a monarch who prized control. His real punishment was not just betrayal or death. It was the slow erasure of his purpose, to live long enough to see the dream he built turn to dust. But maybe that's where he won, because even as his body fell to the axe, his ideas kept moving, across oceans, through centuries, reshaping the way England saw itself. In that way, Raleigh never truly died. And if the letter he left behind that night in the tower was truly his last chart, perhaps it wasn't a map of a place at all. Perhaps it was a map of what lay beyond, the geography of a mind unbroken by chains, unbent by kings. There's a line, scribbled faintly in the margin of his surviving notes, often overlooked but impossible to ignore once read. He that seeks truth may lose the world, but he that fears truth hath already lost himself. It reads less like a farewell and more like a warning. And maybe that's why even now the figure of Sir Walter Raleigh feels both tragic and defiant. A man who dared to serve two masters, the queen who adored him and the truth that devoured him. Because in the end, perhaps his greatest punishment wasn't the scaffold, the exile, or even the betrayal. It was something far deeper. The knowledge that he had glimpsed a world beyond human reach, and that no one else would ever believe him. Yet as the candle burned low that final night, casting shadows that danced like waves across his cell walls, Raleigh smiled faintly, as if seeing something far away, something that no one else could. He whispered, almost to himself, "I have found it." The guards heard the words, but none understood what he meant. And as dawn broke over the Thames, gray light spilling through the barred window, the question remained. What exactly had he found? The answer would not be discovered for centuries, but when it was, it would change everything. For years after his death, Sir Walter Raleigh's name drifted through history like a ghost at sea, half legend, half warning. His story was told in courtrooms and taverns, in the halls of scholars and the whispers of sailors, each retelling bending slightly with the teller's breath. But buried within all those tales was something that refused to die, the faint hum of an unanswered question. What had he truly found? It wasn't until 1907 that the silence began to stir again. A young historian named Evelyn Thorne, newly appointed to the British Museum, came across a shipment of sealed crates from a private estate in Devon. Inside were old navigational tools, fragments of maps and journals attributed to the descendants of Raleigh's crew. Most were damp, eaten through by mold, but one object, wrapped carefully in oilcloth, had survived the centuries. A brass compass, ornate and heavy, its lid etched with a familiar mark. A sun over a winding river. When Thorne opened it, the needle spun wildly, refusing to settle north. It trembled as though alive, twitching toward an unseen direction. Beneath the glass, in delicate, faded script, a phrase had been engraved. The world turns not upon its axis, but upon its secrets. Thorne became obsessed. She spent nights poring over Raleigh's surviving letters and expedition records. The more she read, the more she became convinced that his final voyage was not a failure, but a concealment, that he had deliberately hidden what he discovered. She traced his route through the Orinoco, aligning his recorded latitudes with modern maps, and noticed something strange. His notes placed him not near any known settlement or river fork, but within a vast stretch of uncharted jungle, an area that even today remains largely unexplored. And then she found it, tucked between pages of an unrelated maritime ledger in the museum archives, a scrap of parchment marked with Raleigh's unmistakable handwriting, a sketch of a circular landmass, rivers coiling inward, ending in the same word that had haunted his legend, veritas. The edges were burned, the ink was centuries old, but on the back, faint and smudged, was a second word, written in haste, one no historian had ever seen before. Alive. For weeks Thorne said nothing, but her colleagues noticed the change in her. She stopped eating with them, slept in her office, and began sketching symbols across her notebooks, spirals, suns, and stars, joined by lines that seemed to form no pattern at all. She was seen one night standing in front of Raleigh's portrait in the gallery, whispering under her breath, "He didn't die for gold." 2 months later, she vanished. Her flat was found in disarray, papers scattered, books open to passages about alchemy, astronomy, and ancient navigation. The brass compass was gone. In its place, a single note lay on her desk. He left the world, but not the earth. It would have been dismissed as the madness of obsession, another scholar consumed by myth, if not for what happened the following spring. A research team surveying the upper reaches of the Orinoco River reported an unusual discovery. A stone monument protruding from the jungle canopy, visible only when the sun hit at a precise angle. The formation resembled the outline of a human face, long, bearded, weathered by time. When the team reached it, they found inscriptions carved into the base, in Latin and Old English. The translation was chillingly clear. "Here begins the kingdom of the mind. Beware those who follow." Among the markings was the same sun over river symbol. The British Museum quietly acquired photographs of the site. They were locked away in a restricted archive, labeled under unverified artifacts, colonial era. But copies leaked. Independent historians and occult enthusiasts began to connect the dots. The compass, the missing letters, Raleigh's cryptic maps, and now this monument. A narrative began to form, one too strange to be taught but too persistent to ignore. It suggested that Raleigh had not been searching for El Dorado in the traditional sense, but for something older, a civilization that predated both the Inca and the Maya. One built on principles not of gold and power, but of knowledge. The treasure he spoke of was not material wealth, but a discovery that defied the limits of his age. But if that were true, it meant Raleigh had found something, and chosen to hide it. And perhaps his punishment had been designed to erase not just the man, but the truth he carried. Imagine him in that tower cell, the candlelight flickering across his face, his mind racing through memories of jungle heat and lost cities. Did he fear death? Or did he fear what would become of his discovery in the hands of a king who valued obedience over wonder? Perhaps that was why he spoke so calmly before the axe, not because he accepted death, but because he knew something would live on beyond it. Centuries later, in 1934, a letter surfaced in the personal papers of a Spanish diplomat, written by one of Raleigh's captains, Lawrence Keymis, presumed dead in Guyana. The letter, water-stained and torn, was addressed to no one, but its final line was unmistakable. "He has gone below. The city is not built of stone but of silence. The authenticity was disputed, but it reignited interest in what Raleigh had seen. Some claimed the city of silence was metaphorical, a hidden order of thinkers or explorers devoted to protecting knowledge. Others believed it referred to an actual place, buried or cloaked, untouched since the 16th century. Either way, the pieces of Raleigh's final days began to realign, like constellations forming a pattern long missed. His missing chart, the symbol on the compass, the burned edges of his final map, the recurring word, veritas. Truth. What kind of truth could have terrified monarchs into silence and driven men into madness centuries later? Theories blossomed like weeds, that Raleigh had stumbled upon evidence of an advanced civilization lost to time, that he had found proof humanity's history was far older than the church would ever allow, or that his kingdom of the mind referred to something more mystical, a state of consciousness, a way of seeing the world that blurred the line between discovery and transcendence. But there was another darker interpretation, that the knowledge he found wasn't meant to be known, that it consumed those who sought it, just as it had consumed him. Because the deeper scholars dug into Raleigh's writings, the more they noticed something unsettling. His later poems written in the Tower grew increasingly cryptic. Lines that once celebrated adventure now hinted at dissolution, at the collapse of self. In one, he wrote, "I have seen the shore where thought meets end, and there the waters speak." It sounded beautiful, until you realized he might not have been speaking metaphorically. In 1972, an anthropologist named Dr. Hargreaves led an expedition into the Orinoco Basin to locate the Monument of the Mind. The region had changed little since Raleigh's time, dense, humid, and perilous. On the 10th day, the team's radio fell silent. Only one member returned weeks later, delirious and feverish. His notes were mostly incoherent, but one passage stood out. "We followed the river's curve, as the map said. The water ran wrong, upward. The sun hung where it shouldn't. And I swear to you, we heard voices beneath the surface." He died before he could be questioned, and once again, Raleigh's name slipped back into myth. But his ghost still stirs, in archives, in rivers, in the restless hearts of those who seek what cannot be proven. Because what began as a story of ambition and betrayal now seems to whisper of something far greater. The price of knowing too much. Maybe that's what Raleigh meant by his last words. When he whispered, "I have found it." Perhaps he wasn't speaking of a city or gold, or even truth as we know it. Perhaps he had glimpsed the thin membrane between knowledge and oblivion, and stepped across. If that's the case, then his punishment wasn't meant to destroy him. It was meant to contain him, because there are truths that do not die when their seekers do. Somewhere deep in the jungles he once mapped, the rivers still twist as they did 4 centuries ago. Travelers say the air grows colder there for no reason. Birds fall silent, compasses tremble. And sometimes, when the mist is thick and the sun touches the water just right, you can see the shape of a man reflected where no one stands. His face turned toward the horizon, his eyes fixed on something beyond sight, and if you listen closely you might hear his voice carried by the wind, quiet, defiant, eternal. The world turns not upon its axis but upon its secrets. And suddenly you understand. Maybe we were never meant to find what he found. Maybe it's still waiting for us to try. The jungle had been silent for days. No bird song, no insects, no sound but the heavy breath of the river winding endlessly between the trees. The small expedition boat drifted under the gray-green canopy, its engine long dead, its passengers hollow-eyed and sunburned. Among them sat Dr. Marianne Thorne, Evelyn Thorne's granddaughter, her fingers clenched around a small brass compass that had refused to point north since the moment she stepped off the plane. The same compass her ancestor had once found in a crate over a century ago. The same one with the words etched beneath the glass. The world turns not upon its axis, but upon its secrets. The jungle seemed to press inward with every mile they traveled, as though alive and waiting. Marianne had followed her grandmother's trail obsessively, piecing together the fragments Evelyn had left behind before vanishing. The maps, the letters, the sketches of symbols that repeated across centuries, she had traced them all. And every line pointed here, to a stretch of river that didn't appear on any modern satellite image. It was as if the land itself refused to be mapped. She leaned forward, brushing away a cluster of vines that hung like curtains across the bow. Beneath the roots and fog, something shimmered, faint, metallic, impossible. "Stop," she whispered. The oars froze. The men exchanged uneasy glances. There, half submerged in the mud, was a fragment of stone carved with the Sun Over River emblem. She stepped into the water, ignoring the pull of the current, and touched the worn surface. Her breath caught. The grooves were deep, deliberate, and newly exposed. Not eroded, but broken open, as if the earth had shifted only recently to reveal it. A storm rolled above them, thunder growling through the canopy. The air grew heavy with electricity. Marianne's compass quivered, the needle circling madly before stopping, not north, but directly beneath her feet. The others began to murmur. She looked down at the water, now rippling outward in perfect concentric rings, though nothing had moved. Beneath the surface, a pale shape gleamed, a spiral of stones arranged like a labyrinth, its pattern nearly identical to the one drawn on Raleigh's last map. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then one of the guides muttered in Spanish, "La ciudad del silencio," the city of silence. The same phrase scrawled in Lawrence Keymis's letter centuries before. By nightfall, the storm broke open the sky. Rain lashed through the trees, the river swelling until it threatened to consume the shore. The expedition camped under the shelter of a cliff, where strange carvings wound along the rock face. Images of men holding objects shaped like compasses, their faces turned toward the sky. In the flickering firelight, the carvings almost seemed to move. Marianne sat alone, her notebook open, the pages already soaked. She turned the compass in her hands, tracing its engraving with her thumb. The needle pulsed faintly, trembling with every flash of lightning. She couldn't shake the feeling that the storm wasn't just weather, it was reaction. As if the air itself recognized her presence, sleep refused to come. The jungle was no longer silent. Somewhere in the distance, a low humming began, faint, rhythmic, like the sound of breath through hollow stone. She rose, stepping closer to the edge of the camp. The humming grew louder, blending with the wind until it felt almost human, like a chorus of voices speaking just below the threshold of hearing. She followed the sound through the rain until she reached the riverbank. The water glowed faintly, light rippling from beneath the surface, illuminating the spiraled stones. For a moment, she saw movement, a shape passing through the water like a shadow walking upright. Her hand shook as she lifted the compass. The needle spun, then stopped, perfectly aligned with the spiral below. She whispered into the storm, "Raleigh, what did you find?" And for the briefest instant, she could swear she heard an answer, a whisper so soft it could have been wind or water or memory itself. Veritas. Truth. By morning, the storm had passed, but the river's shape had changed. The spiral that had glimmered beneath the surface was gone, replaced by a still, black pool. Marianne and her team began excavating the exposed stones along the shore, uncovering fragments of tablets and what appeared to be a broken seal carved with Raleigh's crest. The same crest recorded on the logs of his final voyage. Inside one of the tablets, she found something unexpected, a fragment of paper, protected by layers of resin and clay. It bore writing in English, ink faded but legible. "He that follows the river follows himself. Beware the bend where time turns inward." She stared at the words until the letters seemed to move. The phrasing was unmistakably Raleigh's. But that was impossible. No document could have survived intact for 4 centuries in this climate, unless it hadn't been left then, unless someone, or something, had placed it here later. That night she lay awake, replaying every step of her journey. The compass, the symbol, the words her grandmother had left. He left the world but not the earth. What if Evelyn hadn't disappeared? What if she had simply followed the same current Raleigh once did? At dawn, she made a decision. They would go deeper. By midday, the trees grew taller, the river narrower, the air thicker. Every sound, every splash, every cry felt amplified as if the jungle were listening. The compass began to vibrate in her palm, the glass fogging with condensation. One of the crew members swore they were traveling in circles, but the GPS was useless here, showing only static. Then the river bent sharply, a perfect curve like the one Raleigh had drawn on his chart. Beyond it, the air shimmered. The water seemed to rise, bending light like heat over sand. They passed through it, and suddenly everything changed. The sounds of the jungle ceased. The air turned cold. The trees ahead were skeletal, stripped of leaves. The water beneath them was perfectly still, reflective, mirror-like, as though the river had become glass. Marianne's breath caught in her throat. The compass needle had stopped completely, pointing nowhere. In the stillness, she could see their reflections on the water. But something was wrong. The reflections didn't move when they did. They stood motionless, staring back. One of the men screamed. His reflection tilted its head. Then the river erupted. The boat lurched as waves crashed from beneath, though no wind blew. The water churned with light, a deep, pulsing glow that came from below, forming patterns, spirals, words. Marianne clung to the edge, her eyes wide as she recognized the same phrase repeating over and over. The world turns not upon its axis, but upon its secrets. And then she saw it, rising from the heart of the whirlpool, a shape of stone and metal, massive and ancient, covered in symbols that pulsed with light. The top bore a carving of a human face, long, regal, unmistakably English. Raleigh. The compass shattered in her hand. When she awoke, she was lying on the riverbank alone. The boat was gone. The jungle was silent again, impossibly still. She staggered to her feet, her clothes torn, her mind fogged. The sun burned red through the haze. At her feet lay the broken compass, its pieces glinting like fragments of memory. And next to it, impossibly, a book, leather-bound, soaked, but intact. The words on the cover almost erased, yet she could still make them out. The History of the World, W. Raleigh, W. But this was no ordinary copy. Its pages were filled with maps that didn't exist, charts of constellations drawn from impossible perspectives, and passages written in handwriting that shifted between Raleigh's and her grandmother's. Marianne's pulse quickened. She turned to the final page. There, scrawled in trembling ink, were the same two words that had haunted her for months. He found it. Beneath them, a third word, one that hadn't appeared anywhere before. Return. She lifted her head slowly. The jungle shimmered as if rippling with heat, though the air was cool. For a heartbeat, she thought she saw figures standing between the trees, dozens of them, motionless, half shadow, half light. Some in armor, some in modern clothing, their faces serene, watching. And then faintly from the water's edge came a whisper carried by the wind, calm, patient, and heartbreakingly familiar. Marianne. Her grandmother's voice. She turned toward the sound, her breath shallow. The reflection in the water moved again, this time smiling. And for the first time she felt it, the pull of something vast and unseen, as if the river itself was reaching for her, asking her to cross. She took one step closer. The air vibrated, and beneath the reflection, the spiral began to form again, glowing softly. She could feel it. The truth Raleigh had died to protect, the same truth that had claimed her grandmother, now waiting for her. She reached her hand out toward the surface, the water trembling beneath her fingertips, the word veritas glowing like fire. And just before her fingers broke the reflection, before everything changed, she heard another voice, one she didn't recognize, low and distant, echoing through time. Once you see it, you cannot return. The air went still, the reflection smiled wider, and the river began to rise. The water surged upward in a column of silver light, swallowing the reflection whole. Marianne stumbled back as the ground trembled beneath her boots. The air cracked open with a sound like the splitting of the sky. Trees bent inward toward the river, their branches stretching as though drawn by invisible gravity. The compass fragments at her feet began to hum, each shard vibrating with energy. And then the river itself began to breathe. It inhaled. The mist was drawn downward in spiraling tendrils feeding the light, and from within the blinding current rose a structure, colossal, ancient, impossible. It was neither temple nor city, but something between the two, carved into the very bones of the earth. Its walls shimmered with symbols that burned and faded, like constellations shifting in water. Every surface seemed alive, pulsing with memory. Marianne's knees buckled. She fell to the ground, her heartbeat syncing with the rhythm of that light. The whisper returned, louder now, layered, echoing, her grandmother's voice intertwined with others she did not know. Male, female, old, young. 1,000 voices speaking as one. The river remembers what the world forgets. Tears welled in her eyes. She took a step toward the light, then another. The air thickened, pressing against her chest, heavy with heat and electricity. Each breath felt like inhaling time itself. Thick, ancient, alive. When her foot touched the water, it solidified beneath her like glass. She looked down. Beneath the surface flowed not current but images, faces, ships, empires. Her grandmother standing beside a fire, the same compass in her hand. Raleigh kneeling before a glowing stone, whispering prayers to something unseen. 1,000 years collapsed into seconds, playing beneath her like film on rewind. The voice spoke again, this time inside her head. Every seeker becomes the secret. Marianne trembled. What are you? The air answered not with words, but with vision. The light flared, and she was no longer standing by the river. She was there, centuries ago. The jungle had not yet swallowed the world. The sky was a canvas of gold and smoke. Men in tattered English armor staggered through the trees, their eyes wide with terror. Among them, Raleigh, older than she'd imagined, hollow-eyed, his beard streaked with gray. He carried the same book she'd found, bound in leather, pressed against his chest as if it were his own heart. He stopped at the riverbank, breathing hard. Behind him, his men muttered prayers. Ahead, the water shimmered with light, the same spiral, glowing like a wound in the earth. He fell to his knees. "Show me," he whispered. "Show me what I've given everything for." And the river obeyed. The light enveloped him, lifting him from the ground. His scream echoed through centuries, through her until it became something else. A song, long and mournful, vibrating through her bones. The light poured into his eyes, his skin, his soul. When it faded, he stood changed, silent, calm, a man who had seen what no human should. He turned toward her, though she was invisible, centuries apart. And yet, he saw her. Their eyes met across the impossible gulf of time. "You followed the map," he said, his voice both echo and prophecy. But the map was never meant to be read. It was meant to be remembered. She tried to speak, but the air burned in her throat. Raleigh's hand lifted, pointing toward the spiral. "It's not a place, Marianne, it's a passage, not to gold, not to God, to truth, and truth." His voice faltered, his eyes clouded. "Has no mercy," the vision shattered. She was back in the present, kneeling on the glass-like surface of the river. The storm had returned, thunder echoing like cannon fire. The structure that had risen from the depths was now opening, massive doors of stone sliding apart with a sound like mountains grinding. Inside was darkness, infinite, whispering darkness. She stepped forward. The air grew cold. The whispers grew louder. Faces appeared in the dark, Evelyn's among them, her features soft, her eyes shining with both sorrow and pride. "Grandmother," Marianne whispered. Evelyn's lips moved, though no sound came. She reached out a hand. Marianne hesitated, her own trembling. The air between them shimmered with light. Then Evelyn's voice filled her mind, clear and steady. "It isn't death that waits here, my love, it's memory. We don't vanish, we become what we sought." The darkness pulsed. Behind her, the jungle roared like a dying god. The river began to rise again, swirling upward in a spiral of light and water, encircling her. She was suspended between worlds, between what was and what would be. Every heartbeat stretched into eternity. Her grandmother's voice softened. "You must choose. Step through, and you will see. Stay, and you will forget." Marianne's eyes burned. "I can't lose you again." Evelyn smiled faintly. "You never did." A sound echoed through the chamber, the compass shards at Marianne's feet clicking together, reforming in midair. The needle spun wildly, then stopped, pointing not north, not down, but forward, into the darkness beyond the doors. She closed her eyes. The air was thick with scent. Rain, soil, something metallic and ancient. She thought of every step that had led her here, the maps, the letters, the sleepless nights, the voice that had haunted her since childhood. And then she thought of Raleigh kneeling before this same current, whispering, "Show me." She took one breath, slow, shaking, and stepped through. The darkness swallowed her. It was not empty, it was filled with light. Billions of motes swirling in endless dance like stars caught in a current. Each one flickered with an image. Memories not just hers, but humanity's. Empires rising, children laughing, oceans burning, cities vanishing beneath sand. Every thought, every dream, every secret the world had ever buried, preserved here. Spinning in infinite reflection, she floated, weightless, unbound. The whispers resolved into a single phrase, spoken not in words but in understanding. The world turns not upon its axis, but upon its secrets. Tears streamed down her face. She reached out and touched one of the lights. It flared, and she saw her grandmother standing by the fire again, younger this time, writing in her journal. Evelyn looked up, directly at her. "You found it," Evelyn whispered. And then softer. "Now let it go." The lights began to fade one by one. The chamber trembled, cracks forming in the glassy floor beneath her feet. The river's pulse quickened, frantic now. The walls of light flickered between centuries, Raleigh's men screaming, the city burning, Evelyn vanishing into mist. Marianne understood. The river wasn't meant to be opened, it was meant to be kept, guarded by those who understood that truth, once freed, consumes everything. She clutched the compass and the last fragment of the boundary between worlds. "I won't let it die," she whispered. "I'll remember." And as the chamber collapsed around her, she drove the compass into the glowing ground. The light shattered, cascading outward in a wave that tore through the jungle, the river, the storm, resetting everything. The sound faded. The air stilled. When the world righted itself again, the river was calm. The jungle hummed softly, alive once more. The storm had passed, leaving behind silence and dawn. A single boat drifted down the current, carrying one figure. Marianne. She was alive, or something close to it. The compass rested in her lap, whole again, its needle perfectly still. She looked out across the water, her eyes distant, ancient. From the shore, a single figure watched her. A child, barefoot, holding a notebook that looked far too old for her hands. Their eyes met, and for a moment, Marianne saw recognition. The same fire, the same curiosity. The child smiled. Marianne smiled back, a small, knowing curve of her lips. The boat drifted onward, the current pulling her toward the horizon where mist met sunlight. As the jungle closed behind her, a faint voice echoed from the depths of the river, not warning, not whisper, but benediction. Every seeker becomes the secret. And the compass needle moved again, turning toward the light. The river flowed on, quiet, endless, remembering everything. The river gleamed beneath the rising sun, a mirror of gold stretching endlessly toward the horizon. Mist coiled above it like the remnants of a dream, slow and weightless, drifting through the soft hush of dawn. The world was quiet now, no storms, no tremors, no voices from beyond. Just the faint hum of water against the boat's wooden hull, and the rhythm of breathing that seemed to belong to both river and traveler alike. Marianne sat with her head bowed, fingers tracing the smooth surface of the compass that rested in her lap. The once broken relic was whole again, though its glass shimmered faintly, as if holding within it the glow of 100 unseen stars. The needle did not spin anymore. It lay still, pointing neither north nor south, but forward, into the line where water met light. She hadn't spoken since the storm. There was nothing left to say, only the unshakable awareness that she had crossed something vast and irreversible. Her clothes were torn, her hands marked by faint golden scars where the light had touched her. But her eyes, those were different now. They carried something ancient, the quiet gravity of one who had glimpsed too much and survived it. The river breeze brushed her hair back, whispering through it like pages turning. Somewhere in that breeze she could still hear the echo of Evelyn's voice. It wasn't loud anymore. It was soft, woven into the rhythm of the world, as natural as wind itself. On the far bank, the jungle began to awaken. Parrots burst from the canopy in a flurry of color. Insects resumed their song, tentative at first, then full. The earth smelled of renewal, damp soil, green leaves, the sweetness of life after destruction. Marianne's eyes followed the line of trees as they passed, each one reflected in the water like memories doubled. The silence she carried within her wasn't heavy anymore. It was vast, endless, the kind that made space for thought, for meaning. Hours might have passed, or minutes. Time no longer mattered here. The river wound through the heart of the wilderness, gentle and steady. She saw ruins along the banks, moss-covered stones carved with the same spiral symbols she'd seen in the chamber. But now they seemed different. Not warnings, not boundaries, reminders. Guardians of memory, left by those who had walked this path before. She realized then what Evelyn had meant when she said they didn't vanish. They became what they sought. Every explorer, every dreamer, every seeker who had reached this place had left something of themselves behind. Not their bodies, not their names, but the essence of their pursuit. The river carried those fragments forward, weaving them into its endless current. Marianne dipped her fingers into the water. The surface glowed faintly where she touched it. For a moment she saw her grandmother's reflection, young again, smiling softly from within the current. Marianne smiled back, and the image rippled, fading into sunlight. It wasn't grief she felt, it was gratitude. Evelyn had been right all along. The truth wasn't something to find, it was something to become. As the boat drifted farther downstream, Marianne thought of Raleigh, the man who had once knelt by this same river, desperate for a glimpse of what lay beyond human reach. History remembered him as a conqueror, a seeker of gold and glory, a man punished for ambition. But she had seen the truth that history could not hold. He had not been punished by a queen or a court. His real punishment was revelation, to see the unseeable, to touch the infinite, and return to a world that could never understand. He had carried that silence until his final breath, not madness, but knowledge too large for words. And now she understood. That was the river's final gift and curse, not to destroy but to awaken, to remind those who found it that the true treasure of the world was never meant to be possessed, only remembered. The light shifted, rippling across the water in patterns that reminded her of constellations. She leaned back, watching clouds drift overhead. Her body ached, but her mind felt weightless. The journey had been long, dangerous, filled with loss and wonder, but she felt no regret. In some strange way, she had always known this path would end here, alone with the river, where silence meant understanding. A flock of cranes passed above, their wings cutting through the morning light. One dipped lower, its shadow gliding across the water until it touched the boat. Marianne reached out instinctively, her hand grazing its reflection. For a heartbeat, the reflection did not ripple. It met her touch, solid, warm, alive. The crane tilted its head, as if acknowledging her, then rose again into the sky, disappearing into brightness. She smiled. Marianne guided the boat toward the shore. The wood scraped gently against the sand as it stopped. The child stepped closer, her curiosity unshaken, her expression calm and knowing. Marianne hesitated, looking down at the compass. The light within it pulsed once, faint but alive. I found what I needed to remember. The girl's gaze shifted to the water. They say the river forgets no one. Marianne nodded. No, it doesn't. It carries us, all of us, whether we want it to or not. For a long moment, neither spoke. The sun had climbed higher, turning the river to molten gold. The child flipped open her notebook and began to draw. Marianne leaned closer and saw spirals, maps, faces, lines that resembled everything she herself had once traced by candlelight. You've seen it too, Marianne said quietly. The girl smiled. Maybe, or maybe it's been seeing us all along. The answer hung in the air like mist, neither truth nor riddle, but something in between. Marianne felt an ache in her chest, the kind that comes from recognition. She rose from the boat, stepping onto the shore. The earth was warm beneath her feet. She placed the compass gently into the child's hands. It's yours now. But remember, don't follow where it points. Listen to why. The girl nodded solemnly, clutching it to her chest. For a moment, Marianne saw herself reflected in the child's eyes, young again, uncertain but full of wonder. Then she turned toward the jungle. The path was there, waiting, bathed in sunlight and shadow. She took a slow breath, letting the air fill her lungs, feeling the pulse of life all around her. Every sound, the chirp of insects, the whisper of leaves, the murmur of the river, felt connected, deliberate, eternal. As she walked, her mind drifted through the echoes of everything she had seen. Raleigh's hollow eyes, Evelyn's fading smile, the ancient city beneath the water. Each memory unfolded not as something gone, but something continuing, alive in her steps, in the river's endless song. When she reached the rise overlooking the valley, she paused. From here the river stretched to the edge of the world, a silver thread winding through the green. She thought of all the explorers, dreamers, and wanderers who had come before her, who had looked upon this same horizon and wondered what waited beyond it. Maybe they had never truly disappeared. Maybe they were still here, in every current, every gust of wind, every heartbeat of the earth. She whispered into the morning, not expecting an answer, yet feeling it come anyway. We don't find the world's secrets. We remember them. The words lingered, carried away on the breeze. She smiled, a small, quiet smile that felt like closure. And somewhere, deep beneath the river's calm surface, light stirred again. Faint, steady, eternal, like a promise kept. The camera would pull back here if this were a film, rising higher and higher until Marianne was just a figure against the vast green expanse, until the river itself became the only thing visible, a living thread of memory running through the veins of the earth. The sun glimmered on its surface like an eye-opening, ancient and infinite. And in that moment, one last question drifted through the silence, one that would stay with anyone who heard it long after the image faded. What if the world's greatest punishments are not for what we fail to find, but for what we finally understand? The river shimmered, then stilled, holding its secrets close once more, and it flowed on, forever remembering.